making sense of things. This patient is saying, I know the doctor said I have sugar, but if I feel fine, I am fine. And what is my motivation to do something? Why would I do something if my belief is if I feel fine, I am fine? Does that make sense? So my job is not to convince them that they're not fine, but to give them information, to ask them to consider how in fact they can feel fine but still be at risk. Everybody with me so far? All right. So where does motivation come from? We now know, and this is as much science as anything you learned about drugs, we now know that for people to be motivated about voluntary behavior change. How many of you realize patients don't have to take their medicine? They don't have to lose weight. It is voluntary behavior change. Okay? That for them to be motivated, 3 critical factors are needed. There needs to be rapport between the healthcare provider and the patient, and I'll explain to you what I mean by that in a minute. We call this the lever. Rapport between me and the patient gives me the leverage to use my expertise in a way that the patient sees it as an extension of my caring, not putting them in their place. Tell you what I mean in just a minute. Okay? Second, people have to believe that what you're asking them to do is important. To who? It doesn't matter whether it's important to me. It has to be important to them. And second of all, are they confident they can do it? If any of these 3 things are missing, guess what's happening? Noncompliance. Noncompliance. We can predict this now. All right? Okay, so let's keep going. So motivational interviewing is a way of understanding patient sense-making. How many of you know that we are sense-making creatures? We say things like that makes sense. That doesn't make sense, right? And so patients are attempting to make sense out of what happens to them. They're making sense of their illness. They're making sense of the treatment. They're making sense of, do I want to do any of this stuff? Does that make sense? Okay? We can't know how to begin to talk to them about anything that's happening unless we know how they're making sense. And every patient makes sense differently. They all make sense differently. So MI is a set of skills, and we call it the toolkit, these sets of skills, because it's not just one thing. It's a whole bunch of skills. And the reason is each skill must be matched to the sense-making of the patient. Ever heard the expression, if all you got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail? Any of you ever heard that? Some of the older guys like me in the room have heard that. Point is this. Have any of you ever tried to bang a nail into the wall with a screwdriver? I have. Okay? Hammers work better, right? It's important to match the tool to the task at hand. And that's one of the most important things we teach in MI. And it's an exchange of expertise. I exchange my expertise after I find out what the patient understands. It is really a waste of time to do it the other way. It takes too much time to do it the other way. And it's a way of being with patients that it involves genuineness. You cannot fake caring about people. Have you ever had people do fake empathy with you? In fact, that's a contradiction in terms, right? And you'd just rather have them just shut up. Because when it's phony, I'd rather have them not say anything, right? So it's got to be genuine. It's got to come out of a genuine desire to help this person. We exist in health care. Health care should not be an oxymoron. We should be helping people have care. And it needs to be compassionate. So that we are compassionate when the patient makes a decision that's different than what we'd like to see them make. It's their life. Why would we ever get angry at a patient who decides to not quit smoking, which can put them at risk for coronary artery disease, when it's their life? Why wouldn't we be sad that they're willing to put themselves at risk? Everybody understand the question? Because if you're angry or frustrated because your patients aren't doing what you want them to do, the problem's not your patient. Think about that one. The problem is a need to fix people that comes out of this belief that it's my job to make them better. And that's an impossible job. I want to relieve healthcare providers of that responsibility and get them to focus on the job of being caring, compassionate, genuine, and a resource for their patients that is non-threatening. So how does MI work? MI focuses on patient sense-making. As I said, we kind of call this a lock and a key approach. The patient is the lock. You know, if they're not taking their medicine, if they're not losing weight, they're the lock. I've got to figure out what information do I have that fits that lock to open it up to them being willing to consider taking the medicine, losing weight, etc. I cannot know what information or what key will open that lock unless I know how they're making sense of things. Second, sense making is not only about an issue, like when a patient says, you know, everybody in my family has high cholesterol. Nobody's died from it early. They all live to be at least 80. And none of them suffered a stroke or a heart attack. So I don't really know that I want to take this drug that the doctor prescribed. How many of you could hear a patient saying that? Okay? What is the patient's sense about high cholesterol? Couple different things. One, I feel okay, right? I feel all right. Nobody else in my family has died from this prematurely. They haven't had stroke or heart attack, and they're really begging the question, why should I worry about it? Right? How many of you could see that explaining to them the etiology and progression of high cholesterol is not going to be particularly useful right now? That unless your key that fits into this lock addresses how can they be part of the same gene pool and still be at risk? Do you understand? That's what you've got to be able to explain to them. How can they be part of the same gene pool as the rest of their family and still possibly be at risk? Because if you can't explain that, guess what? They're not taking the medicine. How many of you are following me? And so I would look at that patient and say, so, you know, because you feel okay and it sounds like you got great genes in your family, the cholesterol's not affected folks in your family, you're kind of really wondering, do I really need to start taking this medication? What do you think the patient would say? Right. What would they know about me? I get it, right? I get what they're saying. Now I would say, would you mind if I gave you a little bit of information and you tell me what you think about it? What am I saying when I say you tell me what you think about it? A, you're involved. B, it's your decision, right? How many of you can hear how non-confrontational this is? And I've never had a patient say no when I do this because I'm not beating them up about it. I'm not looking at them and saying, well, just because they lived to be 80 and didn't have a stroke doesn't mean you will. And how many of you can hear the comma stupid at the end of that sentence? I have an expression. No matter how many bows and ribbons you put on a pile of crap, still a pile of crap. No matter how nicely you look at a patient and say, just because that didn't happen to them doesn't mean it won't happen to you, you're still saying stupid. How many of you do hear it? Okay? And so then the information I would give them is, when I said, would you mind, and I asked permission because I respect them, I would then say, you know, I really hope that none of those things ever happen to you either. The thing I want you to consider is this. People that come from the same family sometimes have different hair color, different heights, sometimes different eye colors. So there is a little variation within the same gene pool. The whole idea behind you taking the medicine would be for you to make the decision, do I kind of want to take out an insurance policy because this medicine can lower your cholesterol? It's the insurance policy that you would take out with the idea that you might be a little different and you reduce your risks of having a stroke or a heart attack, even though you're from the same family. What are your thoughts? How many of you see that that would be far more effective than the first response? And how many of you can see I now place the burden of deciding should they do this where? On the patient, where it belongs. How many of you hear it as caring, though? Right? Okay. So, now, the other thing that MI is about, the other sense-making that MI is about, is patients are not only making sense of the illness and treatment and the issues, they're also making sense of the relationship. They are sitting back, whether they're conscious of it or not, and making sense of, do I like this person, do I not like this person? How many of you ever dealt with I had a head and neck surgeon. I had surgery several years ago. One of the top 5 head and neck surgeons in the country was one of the top 5 horses' asses I've ever met in the world. I had no question about his competency as a surgeon. I did not like him as a human being. And as a result, I left him as the person that would do follow-up. Because here's what else we know. Patients are making sense of the relationship. When I say to that patient, you know, it sounds like you got great genes, and I hope that's the case for you too, I really do. How do you think the patient is thinking about me? He gets me. Good guy, right? What do you think he's thinking when I say, just because your folks in your family didn't die from this early doesn't mean that's the case for you? How do you think he's thinking about me then? Negatively, right? They're making sense of the relationship. Here's what we know. We know that as soon as patients think negatively of the relationship, this person doesn't care about me, they're trying to put me in my place, they're arguing with me, they're fighting with me, they're wrestling with me, they discount your expertise even when it's correct. Or they don't listen to it at all. They say things like, I'll be darned if I'm going to listen to them when they talk to me this way. How many of you can see it? So, MI addresses both kinds of sense-making because we want the patient's sense to be he or she cares about me and he or she is interested in respectfully addressing my concerns about this illness and its treatment. Okay? And that's why MI works so powerfully well. So here's an example. We kind of talked about this. I don't understand why I need this medicine. I feel fine, and the patient has high blood pressure. How many of you have heard this one? And the typical healthcare provider response is just because you feel fine doesn't mean you are fine. Your blood pressure is 150 over 110. It's elevated. If it stays elevated, you could have a stroke or a heart attack. You don't want that to happen, do you? What do you think the patient's sense of me would be if I said that to them in that way? Do you think they'd like it? And would I be telling them the truth? But they discount it. But if I said to them, so because you feel fine, you're kind of wondering, is it really necessary to take this medicine? How many of you here are different again? Okay? They'd say, right. And I'd say, you know what? You raise a great question. It's a great question, which also encourages them to ask questions in the future. Because I want them to ask questions, because if they don't ask questions and push back in the pharmacy, they're going to go home and just not take the medicine. Okay? And so I would then say again, would you mind if I gave you some information and you tell me what you think? And they'd say, sure. And I'd say, you know, unfortunately, high blood pressure is one of those illnesses that doesn't have any symptoms. And the first symptom is a stroke or a heart attack. And it comes on very suddenly. Your blood pressure is 150 over 110. We know when blood pressure goes below 140 over 90, 130 over 80 if they have diabetes, for example. We know when blood pressure goes below 140 over 90 that the risks of stroke or heart attack go way down, even though you may feel okay and don't know that one might be coming on when your blood pressure remains elevated. Where does that leave you now in terms of wanting to get your blood pressure down? How many of you hear a difference? Okay. It doesn't take longer, does it? It just takes knowing how to do this and teaching people how to do this. Notice when I said to the patient, we know that your blood, we know that when blood pressure goes down to below 140/90, that risks of stroke or heart attack go way down. Notice I didn't say your goal. We hear that in healthcare all the time. Your goal is to get your A1C below 7. No, it's not their goal. It's your goal, and you're imposing it on them. If you give them good information, if you say, we know when A1C or a measure of your blood sugar goes below 7, your risks of the following things go way down. Do you think they can figure out that that's a good place to be? So we don't impose goals on patients, but we do tell them where the checkpoints are. Again, how many of you hear a difference? And for how many of you does it make sense? Okay, here's another example that I like very quickly. My doctor, this was a patient that came into our clinic that I actually dealt with at Auburn. He said, my blood pressure is 145/95. This was a guy that was a runner that had like 10% body fat. And his blood pressure just stayed at 145/95. The doctor put him on a mild diuretic first line. He comes in and he said, the doctor told me my goal is 140/90 or below. I'm not that far off. Do I really need the medication? Now, the temptation is to say, yes, right? But it's a really good question, isn't it? So, what is his sense making? What is he saying his belief is? If I'm not that far off, do I really need to start taking this medicine? That's the question that must be answered in a way that makes sense to him, or guess what? He's non-compliant. Because right now, remember I said rapport, importance, and confidence? Right now, he's not